Hello, my name is Michael Tillotson, and I am a twice-published author. Look at these. These are my books. They're great. Promise. I wouldn't lie to you. But we're not here to talk about them, at least not directly. I want to tell you not about my books themselves, but the process I took to write them. One of the most common questions/comments I see when I mention I wrote a book is, how did you find the time? Or, I'm impressed you have that sort of discipline. Or, I tried to write a book, but I just couldn't stick with it. So, I thought I'd offer some advice. I thought I'd explain a little bit how I managed to write 2 whole books, one of which is pretty honking thick. Like, look at this thing. It's huge. And hopefully, at least, what I'll say might help you get in the habit of writing your own book. So today we're going to be tackling the relatively simple question of, should you write every day? And the short answer is, well, it depends. So let's jump straight into the long answer. The first and most obvious way to go about answering this question is to ask another question. When I wrote my books, did I write every day? The answer is almost. When I first started writing The Heart of the World, which is my first book, I gave myself a goal of writing 1 hour every day. I had an alarm set on my phone for 9 o'clock, and as soon as it went off, I'd wrap up whatever I was doing and then get to writing until at least 10. The thing I came to realize with this strategy, though, is I burnt myself out a lot. Like, a lot. Sure, there were some days where I'd write something down and then go like, oh man, this scene I'm going to write tomorrow is going to be so cool. But more often than not, I found myself starting to dread having to write. Because the thing is, there are a lot of things that people would find enjoyable under normal circumstances, but when they find themselves being forced to do that thing when they don't want to, it becomes a whole lot less enjoyable. And in the worst cases, they can even come to resent that thing. This is why so many people hate reading, but are totally fine with movies and video games and the like. It's not because books are inferior in any way. As an author, that would be really weird if I thought they were. It's because they were forced to do so much reading in school that they just kind of grew to hate it. And yes, well, watching movies in class is also pretty common, or at least was. I haven't been to school in a while. It never goes on for as long. You might have 2 or 3 periods at most where you're watching a movie, but you could have several weeks dedicated to reading a book. And then there were these obnoxious little worksheets you had to fill out while reading. If any book I had in school came with a little worksheet where I needed to remember details throughout the chapter, even if I liked the book while reading it, I wound up hating the book by the time I finished, because I kept needing to remember stupid little details like that there were seals barking on the beach. Anyway, the point is, I was doing this to myself. I kept telling myself, you need to write every single day, even when I didn't want to. If I skipped out on writing any particular day, I just felt awful, but if I forced myself to write when I didn't want to, I wound up hating the process. So I needed to fix things somehow. That was when a buddy of mine suggested I only write on weekdays. Following this advice, I took it a little bit further and only wrote on days where I also went to work. I still followed the same schedule, where I had an alarm at 9 o'clock, and whenever it went off, I'd stop whatever I was doing and I'd write. But it only applied on the same day where I also went to work. This greatly increased my writing proficiency, and while I still got burnt out every now and then, by and large writing became much easier and much more fun. Now, for me, the reason why this worked is because any day when I have work, my brain kind of switches into a sort of get things done mode, which lasts for the whole day, even after I get home. For others, I could see this having the opposite effect, where once they're home from work or school, they just want to shut their brain off and clock out. Ultimately, the point is to find a schedule that works for you. Maybe for you, it's the opposite of what it was for me, and you write better on your days off rather than your work days. There's one more thing I'd also like to point out before moving on to the next big point in this video, and that's the difference between the writing schedule for my two books. Back when I was writing The Heart of the World, I had a manual labor job. I was up on my feet moving stuff around all day. By the time I started writing Witch of the Starlight Coven, though, I had an office job, and furthermore, I did all of my writing when I was actually in the office. Now, to be clear, I was not slacking off. I was writing exclusively in my downtime, such as on my lunch breaks or when I was simply waiting for something like the mail to come in. Don't put your writing above your job. That'll get you fired. I found that this greatly increased my writing efficiency as well. It helped make work more enjoyable, increasing my work efficiency, and it helped me write more consistently because the times I spend writing while I work are the times I spend writing where I have basically nothing else to do. I'm not sitting there like, oh man, I wish I was watching a movie right now instead of writing because I was at work. I didn't have a movie to watch. So, if you have the kind of job where this is an option, it might not be a bad idea to give it a try. Okay, there's one last thing I want to touch on in this video. If you're writing on any sort of schedule, there are going to be days where you're just really not feeling it. This is inevitable. Nobody is going to be on their A game 100% of the time. And if there's something you're doing every day, then naturally there are going to be good days and there are going to be bad days. Which begs the question, what do you do on those bad days when you just open up your computer and you're staring at your document and you're just like, I don't want to do this. Years ago, before I had even conceived of Heart of the World, I finished my first book. It was called something along the lines of The Eternity Chronicles or The Chronicles of the Eternities. I don't actually remember. You might be asking yourself, though, if this was the first book I finished, how come it's not in this wonderful pile of books right here? The answer is simple. It was hot garbage. When I was writing The False Eternity, which was its subtitle, I made a very big mistake. See, the premise of the book was actually pretty neat. There was this prophecy that said the protagonist was going to cause the end of the world on her next birthday, and the villain was actually just trying to stop the prophecy, and the hero thought it was a lot of hogwash, and anyway, it was neat. But when I hit those bad days, and those rough spots, and those writer's blocks, I told myself, write anyway. And I did. I wrote whatever I could. It was better, I thought, to make something. It didn't matter what, as long as I wrote something. As a result of this mindset, there were a lot of scenes in this book that were just absolutely horrible. Like, here's the worst example. I think this is hilarious. The protagonist is in a library where she lives, and she goes out for a walk. On this walk, she passes by a school, but she's carrying a gun on her, so an officer stops her to make sure she's not a school shooter or whatever. And as a result of this encounter, they go back to the library to meet with the chief of police. And the chief tells the officer she's all good, and the story moves on. Like, what? I can't believe I actually wrote that. Like, ugh. Anyway, the book was just littered with all of these garbage scenes like this. The because I just powered through the writer's block. And when I finished the book and it came time to edit, I couldn't do it. People say the first draft is about getting things done, not the quality of things. And that's true, to an extent. But this book was just so out of whack, so littered with these awful scenes that editing the book just felt borderline impossible. The only way it felt like it was feasible to salvage this story was just to restart completely. And that is very demoralizing. I don't know exactly how long the Eternity Chronicles took me, but it took me a while, only for it to turn out to just be scrapped. Oh, that sucks. So, my recommendation to you would be to not do that. Don't just power through the writer's block. If you're not in the mood to write the next scene, you're not in the mood to write the next scene. And if you just try to write it anyway, it's not going to turn out well. But at the same time, you don't want to fall out of the groove. The longer you don't write, the harder it is to start writing again. So I also wouldn't just recommend not writing on those days off. You should still try to write something. Aside from the consistent schedule, the big thing that really helped me when writing The Heart of the World was to have a secondary project. The key word there is secondary. You don't want to have two projects you're working on in equal measure, because they'll just slow each other down. Time spent working on one is time spent not working on the other. However, having a secondary project is helpful, especially if the tone of the secondary project significantly differs from that of your primary project, because it's something you can turn to on those off days. Still get some writers done when you've got a block on your main project. Granted, one of the big follies of writing you often hear is how people have a bunch of half-finished projects because they just keep getting new ideas and jumping straight to a new project. So here's how I went about doing things. When writing The Heart of the World, opening The Heart of the World was always the first thing I did when sitting down to write. It doesn't matter what I was writing yesterday, today I'm writing The Heart of the World. If I find myself just sitting there, staring at the screen and not getting anything done though, I would close out of The Heart of the World and instead open up my secondary project. I'd write that secondary project for the day, and then the next day I'd go back to The Heart of the World. Sometimes that block just wouldn't go away though, and I'd be writing my secondary project consistently for several days in a row. But if I ever found myself writing a full chapter of that secondary project, then I put it on hold. I didn't make it my primary project, that's important. Whatever's blocking me obviously just isn't a small hiccup, so I need to figure out what it is and what I can do about it. The next day, I would sit down and I'd open my brainstorm document and I would write out where I was in the story and where I wanted to go next. And then I would just sit there and work my way through my thoughts until I could figure out where the knot was so I could untangle it. If you have a writing buddy, I imagine talking to them about this would work even better, but I didn't, so I just used a document. Usually after this brainstorming session, I was ready to go. As far as I remember at least, there wasn't ever any moment after doing this brainstorming thing where I was still stuck. However, if none of that works, there's one other trick I know of to help overcome a block. Bear in mind, I didn't use this trick on either of my books. I have used it on some of my more recent drafts, but none of those are finished yet, so I can't say how well it works overall, but anyway, basically it boils down to skip it. Skip whatever scene is giving you trouble. Just put up a pair of brackets, summarize whatever it is you're thinking of doing, and just move on. For me, I've used this a couple of times to skip over fight scenes I'm just not super enthused about writing, so I can get to the juicy character stuff that comes after. The obvious caveat here is you do need to write those things eventually, but if you're just at the end of your rope and you just cannot write how your protagonist punches someone in the face, this might be a good way to get yourself writing again. But anyway, that's all from me. I hope this video has been helpful. Good luck with all your writing ventures, and I'll see you in another video.